alive and well.
So are you?
I don't press it. Sound. Yes, I just.
No, I don't. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I've been warned that they're not terribly concerned about the noise we might make in this auditorium. My name is Bongani Bingwa, so let me try that again. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much. I feel really welcome now. It is my honor, of course, to be your facilitator and moderator this afternoon for this session. It's my great privilege to be amongst so many esteemed minds from around not only the country, but indeed the continent and the world. Now, in my normal life, I'm a broadcaster. If you are a resident of Gauteng, you may listen to a little regional station called Talk Radio 702. It is my job to host the breakfast show of that station. You may also find me on the SABC News channel, where I host the evening show, The Full View. I trust you've had a busy, if not emotional, morning, particularly those of you, of course, who visited what I would call a unique center of memory. And no doubt your visit to the Narrative Center this morning has oriented you, I think, with the values and I think importantly, the sacrifices of the Tambo family for the people of not only this country, but the continent and indeed all of humanity. What a rich legacy, what a contribution to knowledge and humanity. Right, the program will be as follows then. Shortly, I'm going to invite the CEO of the National Research Foundation, Dr. Mulapo Qobela, to give the official welcome and to introduce our keynote speaker, the Honorable Minister of Science and Technology, Madame Mamologo Kubai-Ngubane. Ma'am, I should assure you, the last time you and I met was in my carte blanche days. I think you came to our office. And you'll know, of course, that Carte Blanche is an investigative television program, but I have it on good authority that there are no hidden cameras here today. I practiced that one, actually. You're a good sport. Thank you very much. After the Minister's address, we will have a panel discussion with some esteemed leaders and researchers in key disciplines from across the continent as we discuss the championing of research excellence on the continent of Africa. It's going to be an interactive session, which is part of the reason I was trying to get everyone to be a bit vocal. So I'd appreciate, and certainly I'm sure they would, appreciate your participation in the conversation so that I don't hog all the questions. But that's going to come up a bit later on, and I'll introduce them to you as they come forward, and we'll contextualize what they will say. So then, without any further ado, let me invite Dr. Qobela, our host.
Our Minister of Science and Technology, Mema Moloko Kubai-Ngubane, an absolute pleasure to have you, Minister. The chairperson of the Adelaide and Oliver Tambo Foundation Board of Trustees, Ndada Dumangosi, an absolute pleasure to have you with us. Mr. Keith Banerjee, the First Secretary of the High Commission of Canada, and other members of the diplomatic corps that are with us this afternoon. A very special friend, Mr. Nasser Faruqi, the Director for Technology and Innovation at the International Development Research Centre of Canada. We commonly refer to as the IDRC. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. My chairperson, I must remember who my boss is, in addition to our minister. Our chairperson, Dr. Nombo Melelo Oboko, the chair of the board of the National Research Foundation. And in our midst, we have other board members and other senior executives of science granting councils on our continent. And I particularly want to mention Mozambique is with us today, Dr. Victoria de Jus, who is the head of the Research Foundation in Mozambique. We have colleagues here from Namibia, from Zambia, and Botswana. Our panelists today, Professor Keke, Dr. Sibanda, Dr. Opara, and the one and only Professor Molot. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, good afternoon. Bongani, I don't have your power. It really is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this really auspicious occasion. Today is very special, as we are gathered here to honor and celebrate the legacy of an esteemed leader, a principled person, a visionary who envisaged a developed, peaceful, and prosperous continent, the late President Oliver Reginald Tambo. As we remember and celebrate the legacy of President Tambo, it is fitting that we do so in the context of his passion for mathematics and science, and in the recognition of the significant and immense possibilities that are held in the power of knowledge, the power of science and technology, the power of research to change the continent's future. President Tambo stood out as a giant among his generation. For those of us that are young enough and listen to Radio Freedom, they would remember his voice. His generation understood that building strong bonds of solidarity with other nations was an imperative, not only to ensure the liberation of our country, but especially to ensure the liberation, peace, and development of our continent. We honor this afternoon this Pan-Africanist leader in many ways, but today we are delighted to be hosting jointly with the Adelaide and Oliver Tambo Foundation this event. The Minister will talk to the big announcement a little later, but we really are honored to have you, Minister, to be with us this afternoon, to give us a keynote address on reflecting on the life of President Tambo and to announce that major continental initiative which is intended to promote and support research excellence in human capacity development on our continent. Initiatives, ladies and gentlemen, of this nature, particularly continental initiatives that want to change the lives of our people, are not possible without strong partnerships. In this regard, I really want to specifically acknowledge the International Development Research Centre of Canada, the IDRC. We have been in partnership with the IDRC for many, many, many years. The IDRC has been one of the NRF and South Africa's most steadfast partners, working with us pre-1994. They worked with us, the Canadian people worked with us throughout the transition into our democracy. They supported us in shaping our first national policy on science technology, among many other policy choices that a new democratic government was intended to introduce. Lately, we have worked together to co-design, co-implement continental programs, such as the Science Granting Council Initiative in Sub-Saharan Africa, trilateral research chairs that are being held by research chairs here in South Africa, in Canada, and in at least one African country. At the moment, we have chairs in Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, and Canada. We're also excited to be joined by our esteemed panelists, scholars from our continent, who will deliberate on the topic of today, championing research excellence in Africa. Professor Okeke, an absolute pleasure to have you, ma'am. We know you've come a long way. We want to thank you hugely for making the time. Professor Sibanda, an old friend from Zimbabwe. Professor Okeke is from Nigeria. Professor Lana Sopara, one of our research chairs in post-harvest technology at the University of Stellenbosch, and Professor Maloto from the great University of the Witwatersrand. An absolute pleasure to have you. I want to also say something about our equally esteemed moderator, Mr. Bongani Bingwa. He was very naughty, Minister, by asking that there are no microphones or cameras. But I want to ask him, when does he sleep? At 4 o'clock in the morning, he's on that radio station, the radio station. And in the evening, he's on SABC. I have to mention SABC. I can't mention that other radio station. But really, it's an absolute pleasure. Bongani is not just a journalist, but he is somebody who reads and writes, and it's a scholar in the making. And I really want to thank you for making the time to be with us this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, it really now is my honor to welcome and introduce our keynote speaker, the South African Minister of Science and Technology, Mema Moluku Ngubane. For those of us that don't know her, come and talk to me during tea. Minister Ngubane, among many things, is a member of the National Executive of the African National Congress, has handled many portfolios, and she is now the leader of our science, research, and innovation system. Please give her an extremely warm African welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Q. I must say, as the former Minister of Communication, we promote all platforms of communication. I'm still trying to search. I figured out Dr. Phil, but I don't know what Dr. Q does. So Dr. Phil has to help me in figuring out what do I get from Dr. Q. Because I know when I'm not well, I go to Dr. Phil. Thank you very much, Dr. Q, Bongani. It's always a pleasure to interact with you in various platforms. I think we really appreciate your work. Let me acknowledge the NRF Board Chairperson, Dr. Oboko, acknowledge the Ambassador of Canada, acknowledge the Director General of the Department of Science and Technology, Phil Mujwache, the advisors, senior executive members, leadership of the NRF executive team that is here, and board members of our science councils that are here. Also acknowledge Dr. Jean Label, CEO of IDRC. Let me acknowledge my leader, comrade, to me remains my leader, and Comrade Dumangosi, who is also the chairperson of the O.R. Tambo Foundation, and together with other trustees who are here, acknowledging Ms. Msimang, the CEO of the O.R. Tambo Foundation, also colleagues who have joined us from the region. I acknowledge, I heard Dr. Q saying we've got colleagues from Mozambique. And ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, let me say it's always quite a pleasure as a young person who grew up under the leadership of the African National Congress to always find an opportunity to celebrate and talk about our leaders. I regard myself young because when you talk about President O.R. Tambo, I'm not even just young, but I'm a toddler because of the giant that he is. So it is important for me as I stand here and acknowledge and appreciate the moment to be able to celebrate this greatest president of the African National Congress, a leader who belongs to an outstanding generation of leaders that brought us our democratic breakthrough. Oliver Tambo's centenary year was celebrated last year, during which many spoke about his life and his work, and more importantly, about his commitment to the struggle for freedom, which was motivated by his love for his people. In addition to that, much has been written about him. Many capable men and women have said a lot about President O.R. Tambo. In addition to that, much has been written about him by many capable men and women, which begs the question, what is it that one can say about President O.R. today that has not been said before? In preparing for this remark, I thought it important for me to focus on one of those aspects of his life that our society can draw guidance from, especially at the time we are living in. In the lecture titled, I quote, "Can one lead a good life in a bad life?" unquote. The famous philosopher Judith Butler took up a question first posed by Theodore Adorno, for whom the lecture was dedicated, which sought to answer the question, how does one lead a good life in a bad life? The question was underscored by the difficulty of finding a way to pursue a good life for oneself, as oneself, in the context of a broader world that is structured by inequality, exploitation, and forms of effacement. She went on to identify two problems associated with this very question. The first is how to live one's own life well, such that we might say that we are living a good life within a world in which the good life is structurally or systematically foreclosed for so many. The second problem is, what form does the question take for us now? Living a good life can be interpreted in two ways. The one way is that it can be identified with economic well-being, prosperity, and even security. However, economic well-being, prosperity, and security can be achieved by those who are corrupt and those who exploit others. This means that if we perceive the good life in this way, even those who are not living a good life can also be said to be living a good life. The other way is to identify the good life as the pursuit of a moral life characterized by resistance, by joining a movement that seeks to change the conditions that render other people subhuman, and then seek to change those conditions. When such a resistance movement calls for a new way of life, a form of livable life, then it must, at that moment, enact the very principles it seeks to realize. It is the latter that animated Oliver Tambo. President O.R. realized that being good was not only limited to the province of his personal relationship with God. A devoted Christian, as he was, he insisted to show indeed that being good or living a good life was about doing good in the world we live in and being good to others. When he chose the path of resistance by joining the African National Congress, he joined a movement that was saying no to the life of oppression of blacks under apartheid, and the same time saying yes to a life that was envisioned in the Freedom Charter. As a president of the African National Congress, President O.R. championed the notion of democracy and non-racialism, enacting the very principle that the African National Congress sought to realize for South Africa. His dedication and resolve for the pursuit for freedom made President O.R. predictable to his comrades and those who knew him well. Not predictable in the sense that he was boring, predictable in the sense that his commitment to the struggle was consistent, such that he would advance it in whatever platform that he found himself. Thus, when his close friends and comrades, President Nelson Mandela, was asked to write a foreword for a book which was published as a collection of O.R. Tambo speeches titled O.R. Tambo Speaks, all of which he had not read, he thought that his task is made relatively easy by the fact that the theme and quality of President O.R.'s speeches are fairly predictable. President Mandela correctly predicted that, I quote, his speeches and writings will in all probability include a detailed review of the current political situation in South Africa, the kind of society for which the people are fighting, unity of the people, the mapping out of the short and long-term goals of the ANC, the strength and weaknesses of the ANC, negotiating with the government, relations with our neighbor, and the rest of the world, end quote. President O.R. chose to live a good life in a bad life. He chose to live a life of resistance under a bad life of colonization and apartheid. After obtaining his matric with distinction in 1938, went to the University of Fort Hare and registered for his BSc, majoring in physics and mathematics, which at the time was very new for anyone to study these subjects. After completing his degree, he spent 4 years of his life in the furtherance of understanding of maths and science. As a teacher at St. Peter's, Oliver Tambo made a huge contribution in stimulating young minds in the search of truth, scientific truth. The pursuit of truth is one of the elements that science and liberation politics share. The development of science is based on the pursuit of truth about objective reality. It is this very pursuit that has helped humanity to master the environment such that we are now able to husband it for our own purpose. It is through the truth discovered through science that technology has come into being. The truth about the objective reality is also important in liberation politics, in that for any activist to effect meaningful change, he or she needs to have a correct understanding of objective reality. One needs to know what has to be changed, why it should be changed, and to what new form or shape should it be changed into. Failure to understand the objective reality truthfully will make it difficult for any activist to change the undesirable conditions that make up the bad life. Working alone in a lab, a scientist can run out a patient's demand by the pursuit of scientific truth, hidden in the riddles of nature, and get tempted to manufacture evidence to support a hypothesis. The consequence of such unethical conduct for humanity can be disastrous. Such was the case with eugenics that we have seen recently as well. Similarly, a revolutionary who, when tempted by the charms of power, begins to lie and claim easy victories because he refuses to acknowledge the difficulties of persecuting struggle for change, can cause untold damage to those that he or she leads. We will recall that one of the things that led to the fall of the Soviet Union was falsification of reality. At all times, President O.R. Tambo never succumbed to the temptation of populism. He always made sure that whatever position he advocated and encouraged others to adopt were always informed by what is true of reality. In this way, for President O.R., the pursuit of the truth was not for its own sake, but it was the pursuit of truth, whose purpose was to create livable conditions for all of humanity. His concern for humanity was not only limited to the borders of South Africa, it extended beyond our borders to the whole continent and the rest of the world wherever there was injustice. Reflecting on the importance of the then forthcoming meeting of the OAU Ministerial Council in 1975, in his presidential address to the extended meeting of the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress, President O.R. Tambo echoed the Pan-Africanist vision of Kwame Nkrumah when he said, I quote, "It is a meeting about the goals and the future of our struggle, the future of the colonized, oppressed, exploited, and subjected to racial indignities. It is a meeting about the future of Africa. It is a meeting whose results will test anew," President declared, "that the independence of any one country is meaningless, repeat, meaningless, except in the total liberation of Africa," unquote. President O.R. Tambo African Research Chair's initiative, whose key objectives, amongst others, is to contribute to expanded research and innovation capacities in and for Africa, in alignment with the African Union Agenda 2063 and the African Union Science, Technology and Innovation Strategy for Africa, is a good way to honor the legacy of a leader who dedicated his life to the liberation of our African continent. For many years, the African continent has been lacking in the development of science and technology, and this deficit has been at the center of the developmental challenges that many of our countries are facing. For this reason, the strategy I have referred above is firmly anchored on 6 distinct priorities areas that contribute to the achievement of the AU vision: eradication of hunger, achieving food security, prevention and control of disease, communication, protection of our space, living together and building the society, and wealth creation. As the Department of Science and Technology, we support the O.R. Tambo Africa Research Chairs initiative. We are very pleased that 60% of these chairs will be awarded to female researchers, as this is in line with our departmental objective of reducing gender inequality in research. Science should not be a preserve of any race or any gender. It should be an inclusive enterprise. I'm certain that President O.R. Tambo would have agreed with the eminent scientist Freeman Dyson, who wrote in his essay called "The Scientist as a Rebel," published on the New York Review of Books, that said, I quote, "The vision of science is not specifically Western. It is no more Western than it is Arab or Indian or Japanese or Chinese. Arabs and Indians and Japanese and Chinese had a big share in the development of modern science, and 2,000 years earlier, the beginning of Asian science were as much Babylonian and Egyptian as Greek. One of the central facts about science is that it pays no attention to East and West and North and South and black and yellow and white. It belongs to everybody who is willing to make the effort to learn it," unquote. Because President O.R. Tambo chose to live a good life in a bad life, he would have insisted that the pursuit of truth in science should not be for its own sake. Instead, it should be aimed at elevating Africans and removing them from poverty, disease, and conflict. Thank you very much, Program Director.
Thank you very much, Minister, for that reflection on the life and influence of Oliver Tambo. And of course, let me also, because it is part of what we journalists do as we are Jajara, we give you news about people because they don't always know we know things about them. May I also tell you that the Minister was recently nominated as a member of a new Global Artificial Intelligence Council. And no doubt there's going to be phenomenal work that's going to come of her participation in that. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you to our Minister. The fight for freedom must go on until it is won. Until our country is free and happy and peaceful as part of the community of man, we cannot rest. Those were the words there of Oliver Tambo himself. And in light of those words, let me invite Dr. Q to return to the stage because he has a special announcement.
Minister, with your permission to add and punctuate, and maybe for the journalists that are in the House, and for those that might not have heard the announcement that you made, you, through this initiative, have established 10 Oliver Reginald Tambo research chairs that will be tenable on our continent to pursue those priority areas that you have listed. They will be tenable on all countries, all of our universities that really want to push the boundaries of knowledge, except for South Africa, Professor Moloto. So this is a continental initiative supported by the IDRC and the South African government, and I really want to thank you to start that off with. Colleagues, the initiative seeks to recognize individual excellence. As I said, it will be to support the work that we've been doing in the 15 countries of the Science Granting Council initiative, whether it's in Mozambique or Cote d'Ivoire or Burkina Faso, Ghana, Senegal, Tanzania, where President Tambo spent many, many times visiting and working from Tanzania. And we are hoping that this initial 10 will be the basis of the work that we will be doing together as the South African government under the National Research Foundation, under your leadership, to be able to advance research and knowledge on our continent. We'll be doing this in partnership with our sister agencies on the continent. So we will be working with FNI in Mozambique, with NACOSTI in Kenya, with the National Council for Research and Innovation in Namibia, and many others that we work with on our continent. And so I want to just simply want to thank you, Minister. I know that Dr. Duma is going to thank everybody, but I want to thank our government under your leadership, Minister, for making this thing possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those words then, Dr. Krobela. Listen, as we're going to be discussing very shortly, I think really the call of the hour is that the money can be found, the money is there, but really the challenge is to now create partnerships, partnerships that will make what really I think is going to be an historic initiative that's just been announced. And obviously collaboration is the key to any partnership, as you would all know. There are a few boundaries, as you've heard, that have been placed on this. So the idea really is to seek partnerships far and wide and really to let the call ring loud and to let it ring far and wide. So it was in that context that I quoted those words by Oliver Tambo, who understood that South Africa's freedom, that when democracy would come, South Africa would not only need to renew itself, but would need to take a proudful place in the community of nations. So I'm going to then ask that we release the Minister and Dr. Q as I call up our panelists to come and participate in our conversation. To set the scene of the panel discussion, each of the four panelists that are going to come on stage are going to offer some introductory remarks, and they've been asked to cover the following thoughts. Specifically, they've been asked to answer the question, are there ways of defining research excellence for and in Africa that are different from the rest of the world? And if so, in what ways? And obviously the question would be why. Secondly, they will touch on how has research collaboration enabled their careers? And are there aspects that they would like to share that perhaps they could have avoided in managing certain collaborations? Thirdly, they will address the issue with the growing need to show societal and economic impacts of public-funded research. How have they considered these aspects in the context of what they do? And fourthly, what would they like to see funders do differently to support research excellence across the continent? Pan-African initiatives such as the OR Tambo Africa Research Chairs Initiative are rooted in both preserving excellence legacies, honoring Tambo, Oliver and Adelaide Tambo, and promoting greater partnerships amongst African researchers. And I think really that's what this announcement has been about. So we'll be asking then our panelists what, in their opinions, would be the determinants of success for such initiatives and what should be avoided in implementing them and making sure they take off the ground. So those are going to be their introductory remarks. They're going to try and cover those from their perspectives. Each of them will be given around 10 minutes to offer those introductory remarks, and then we'll get into the panel discussion. So I'm going to invite them to come on stage one by one and take a seat. I will obviously occupy the very last one, but in this order, please come ahead, come on to the stage and take your seat. We'll start then with Professor Francisca Neka Okeke, who is an internationally recognized professor of physics at the University of Nigeria, with specific research interests in geomagnetism, atmospheric physics, and climate variability. She has contributed significantly to the development of physics at both the secondary and tertiary level, and she has a particular interest and a focus on women and girls. All right, our second panelist is Professor Umezuruke Linus Opara, who is a chartered agricultural engineer. He's also the distinguished professor at Stellenbosch University, where he holds the DST NRF South African Research Chair in Post-Harvest Technology. Professor Opara is a leading and passionate advocate for the role of research and human capacity on Africa's socio-economic development and integration. Right, our third panelist is Dr. Lindiwe Majele Sibanda, who is a senior research fellow at the Center for the Advancement of Scholarships at the University of Pretoria, and also the former vice president for country support policy and delivery at the Alliance for a Green Revolution for Africa, AGRA. And our final panelist is Professor Nosipho Moloto, who also holds the DST NRF Nedbank South African Research Chair in Energy Materials at Wits University. Her research focuses on syntheses and characterization of various types of semiconductor nanostructures and their application in solar cells, gas sensors, and biolabels for early diagnostics for diseases. All right, so those then, folks, are our panelists. I'm going to ask each of them, as I said a little earlier, to come forward to give their introductory remarks within the scope that I outlined a little earlier on. So I'm going to ask Professor Okeke to come forward and be the first.
Good evening, everybody. The Honorable Minister had just left us, but at least I have to honor her by recognizing her presence before she left. Now I'm coming to the questions here. I need to, first of all, thank the Minister for seeing to the growth of science and technology in Africa, for the time and for everything he has done. Now, when we are defining research excellence, it's not supposed to be different from the research excellence we envisaged all over the world. But the only difference lies in personnel, infrastructure, facilities, and what have you. And to achieve this, to achieve our research excellence, we must have to therefore address these three aspects, not only three of them, but at least these are the major ones. And the issue of manpower is very vital. And not to talk of facilities. You can have manpower, but no facilities. Then it will look like the research excellence we are talking here is different from the other research excellence we are addressing all over the world. So if these are put on board, we can achieve research excellence. And to make research difference, make it different from what we have everywhere, we must have to consider addressing using our own local available resources, whereby when we use them, the society at large will benefit from what our research result will be giving us. Because most times, what we address is not what we visualize here. And even from the elementary, secondary, university level, is still the problem with us. Because when you do basic research with your local available resources, it has a long way to go in advancing and making a research excellent. Because when you talk about your result, you have to address the issue of how the society will benefit from that. Then, again, it is very, very important to address the collaborative research effort we have here. Most of the time, we are not strictly encouraging collaborative research, be it inter, or what have you. We need to address it because it is from collaborative research that we improve on our existing knowledge and then have more to add in the already one we know. We cannot make it all alone. If we say that we have to lock up ourselves and do it alone, no. We have to exchange ideas, and that will lift up our research results, and thereby getting to what we get to call the research excellence. We cannot do it all alone. And all I can say that the collaborative research has helped me as I'm standing here. I know that if not for the collaborative research I had during my postdoctoral in Japan for more than 1 year in the University of Tokyo, and the collaboration I had with Professor Walker in the University of Natal, Durban in South Africa here, and the one I have in US with Oliver Martins, I wouldn't have, I'm sure. They seriously contributed to where I am today. So I must say that research collaboration is very, very necessary. And again, I have to address the issue. We need to be very determined. We have to be serious. No room for laxity if we want to encourage our research and make it what others are elsewhere. Let me not mention places because there are some places in this Africa that are almost attaining the Western countries' research level. But then, sometimes we find out that we Africans are very conservative. Sometimes we don't want to share our knowledge with others. Teamwork. We become selfish at times, and that does not help us. And then we need to know that it is very necessary and very important when we talk about this research, what follows it will be funding. How is this research work we are doing funded? Sometimes, to be fair to some funders, most funders, not all of them, they just promise and give an envelope and then expect you to do, they might give 1 million, they expect you to do something 10 million could do. And that money they have given, they expect you to give them feedback, to give them kickback, which is not right for a research to be an excellent research, because in so doing, you need to learn to manage up what, you need to be transparent, you need to be honest, we need to be open and say, oh, this is for research, and it must be for research. And again, I had also advised the funders, if you promise 10 million, give 10 million and look out. Don't look behind to see, am I getting 10%? That is what is wrong with us. And if you don't do that, what you can do is to monitor the research project you are funding. Don't just give the money and get away. Judiciously, and that will make everybody sit up. And then we talk about getting relevant results, getting excellent results from our research that will benefit everybody. And now, if you do that, because some funders, when they do that, they will want to monitor quite all right. But at the same time, your products, your research results, who are benefiting from that? Because if the society, the people you are serving, they are not driving any, I'm not talking about those that funded it, but the society, are they benefiting? If they are benefiting, they will support you in a way you will not understand. It's not only money you can use in doing research. The supports of this can yield further funding from other branches or areas of government. Then, again, let me come. What is the next question? Promoting greater partnership. Okay, now that we have talked about the funders, the researchers, because you must work hand in hand. You cannot isolate one from the other. If you work hand in hand and come to a compromise that you need an excellent result. I don't want this money. I don't want any percentage. What I know is that put it and you monitor them. You will come up with a very good result. And that is why when I heard the minister mention that 60% of this research he has mapped, of this funding he has mapped, 60 should go to female shareholders. It is very encouraging and interesting. This will be successful only when efficient, serious coordinator or the chair and the first-class researcher that is focused and determined is chosen. A researcher that is transparent and accountable, because what matters in everything we do that involves money is accountability. Can we account for what we are giving? Can you boast of the product that your research is yielding? If you produce something that will not be beneficial to anybody, is it useful? No, it is not. I will just say that the money has been wasted. So if you can account for what you mean, so the accountability is, being accountable is the research, is the key word and watchword here. We should be work without discrimination. The discriminative attitude is the worst thing that can happen to researchers. And being antagonistic also could destroy your research group. Don't see anybody as the same. See anybody, if you are from South Africa or from Nigeria or from Ghana, if I'm from Ghana or from, I see everybody as being from that country. Don't go to look whether this person is from here or from here. That will not yield a good result. And then we need powerful team research work group. This should be encouraged. Intra, and transdisciplinary research teamwork is what should be encouraged so that we have to join resources. Not when I am working here. Maybe somebody, I'm South Africa working, somebody in Botswana, somebody in Nigeria, somebody is doing the same thing. You don't want to share with the person. You don't want to know what he's doing. I'm on my own. That is not research. While I was in Japan, I noticed that there is this strong teamwork. It's not just the university. It's not even only from Japan. They invited people even from China. I'm happy to say even the Chinese will attest to that. They learn from them. They are very open. And that is why their technology is going higher and higher. Once you start being, what do I call it, discriminative, and you don't want people to share your knowledge you share is more than the one you have with you, because 2 heads are better than 1. Then talk about 10 or 40 heads. There will be some improvement in our educational system. Because right now, I will tell you, most people, what they do is just people to hear their name. And once your name is heard, that's it. You don't know what happens to others. Please, that is what we have to look into. And let us not rush to see, we are getting this, and once you get it, what next? Okay. I still remember that in one of the conferences, which this great man, Tambo, gave in Johannesburg, sorry I have forgotten the year, he asked a pertinent question. And I'm sure, till today, I'm not sure we Africans have succeeded in giving answer to this question. I quote him, he said, African Renaissance, is this still a concept, I quote, concept or reality? Unquote. I don't know now whether I will say African Renaissance is a reality or is still a concept. It's left to us in this room to answer that question. If it is a reality, then we are there. If it is not, we have to double up and do something about it. That is the question here, as I remember. But the date, I've forgotten. But that conference was in Johannesburg. So if it is a reality, we Africans, we are there. If it's still a concept, we have to double up. And we don't do it without our research work. Because, like I said in the morning, there will be no meaningful, sustainable development in any nation without basic research in sciences. And of course, knowledge of science. Science is the basis of technology. And science and technology are the basis for development of any nation. So if you combine the two, invariably, we cannot do without them. We cannot emphasize. So we have to take note and be sure that what we are doing will lead to improvement of knowledge in Africa. So having said this, I will also have to note that a tree cannot make a forest. And since a tree cannot make a forest, if I am in isolation, stays on my own, and say I am working with Nigerian groups, it is okay, but it's not very okay. So what I am trying to emphasize is that we need team research work, strong one, and we need collaborative research work so that our Renaissance we are looking at will not be a concept, but will come to be a reality. I think I have answered some of the questions, if not all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Okeke there. I'm going to then call upon Professor Opara to come forward and give his introductory remarks.
Thank you, moderator, honorable minister, colleagues and friends. This is a very exciting time to be an African. It's also a very exciting time to be in Africa. 2 weeks ago, I was in Abuja for the launch of the African Scientific Research and Innovation Council. And 2 weeks from that, we are here now to launch this grand continental agenda. Very, very exciting. Very exciting because I've spent the last 30 years of my life around the whole world, from Oceania to Europe to Asia to the Middle East to my own continent, Africa, trying to spend my life thinking about how science research can make an impact in the lives of people. Earlier today, we spent some time on the graveside of our own O.R. Tambo and the wife. It was a very touching moment. And as a scientist, suddenly it appeared to me that this man represented everything every scientist wanted to be. You had an activist. And the reason I said using this was to try to answer some of the questions that have been asked. As a scientist, I saw an activist, not just on the political scene alone, but an activist in science. And I'll come back to this very quickly before I finish. But I also saw a lot of passion. I also saw a lot of leadership. And when you combine all this together, we're not surprised that God blessed us with somebody like O.R. Tambo and his family. When the Americans landed on the moon and came back, there was a bit of brainstorming as to why did we do this? How did we end up doing this? And the story goes this way, that those people who landed in the moon and came back sat together and says, what are the lessons that we have learned? And 3 things came out. The first one was leadership. And I'm talking about leadership now, interpreting it in terms of science as well. So the first one was leadership. There was a very clear, strong leadership from the top. And I think that's what we are seeing this week here. There was also knowledge and technology. Obviously, the technology that was available when the Americans landed in the moon was nowhere compared with what we have today. But when they came back, they were surprised that the little technology they had at that time was able to get them land in the moon. The third one was the will of the people. So as governments, as scientists, how do we carry the will of our people and pursue a dream, a vision of what is possible that can convince them that it's worth investing in science and technology? Because health is important, primary health, schools are important, roads are important. Everything is important. But how do we convince our leadership that it's important also to invest in the O.R. Tambo African Researchers Initiative? That is something that we need to think about. And the last one then that comes to my mind is, how does this all make sense? How do we have the impact? And that comes to the issue of socio-economic impact. Now, if you look at Agenda 2063, one of the key pillars of it was the idea of an African integration. What a way to do good science, have impact in society, and promote the integration of our African continent. So these are very, very important. Another aspect that is important also, because in the last 10 years, as I was introduced, I've held a South African research chair in post-harvest technology. And one of the things that really hurts me as a researcher, very, very passionately, is the scramble for the African talent at the moment. This is, to me, more serious. Obviously, I didn't live at the time of slave trade, and nothing should be compared with slavery. But I can tell you today, in my own experience of the world, in terms of the knowledge economy, no longer about harvesting resources and selling around the world. If knowledge economy is going to determine who survives on this planet, then the scramble for African brains and talent is something that we have to take very seriously about, both in the way we set up the research years and the ability to attract talent from all over the world, including our own sons and daughters, to work on the African continent. In the last 1 week or so, I've received emails from 3 of my colleagues from Asia, from North America, from Europe, willing to offer any African with a first-class scholarship the next day to come to their lab. So why would my colleagues do it? How come I cannot offer the same opportunity to my own brothers and sisters in the same continent? That is the question we should be asking ourselves if we're going to survive in this knowledge economy that is looming ahead of us. If I bring it much nearer home then and say that in the last 10 years that I've held a South African research chair, how did we go about doing this to make sure we have the kind of impact that we're talking about? The first thing was the principle behind the chair that we set up here. Funded by South African government, the scholarships are very specific in terms of the percentages of Black, white, and South Africans. So that was our primary focus. But what we did was strategically and deliberately, we said that we are going to leverage this funding and get money from industry, get money from our partners, get money from our friends to enable us create a platform for the rest of Africa. This is very, very important. So we're not going to think that if somebody holds that O.R. Tambo African Research Chair, that the money given by the DSC or NRF is the only thing that you're going to need. If you want to make the type of impact, we must be able to find leaders of science who will be prepared to work hard, extremely hard, to leverage this funding in order to deliver the type of innovation and societal impact that we are talking about. That's what we did. So we spend a lot of time on the continent networking with universities, with agricultural research councils, with the national research councils, to the private sector, to NGOs, to individuals, high net worth individuals who were prepared to offer scholarships in addition to the money we are getting from NRF. This is the kind of philosophy we want to talk about. So if our O.R. Tambo chair is located in Tanzania, then there should be no reason why students from Morocco, from South Africa, from Zimbabwe, from anywhere, should not be able to congregate in that continent, that part of the continent, and do the type of work they want to do. So leveraging funding and relationships becomes very, very important. The other point then is what are the lessons we have learned from this? If we do it right, then we can begin to now create additional opportunities for the people. For example, as the new president of the International Commission of Agricultural and Biosystems Engineering, I was shocked that when I go to these meetings, I was almost the only one from my continent sitting on the table. And I said, this is not acceptable. So I deliberately used the auspices of the South African Research Year to hold a conference in Stellenbosch and establish the Pan-African Society for Agricultural Engineering. This is a way of thinking. We didn't complain there was not enough money. We leveraged the little we had and convened our friends around the world, said that we need to talk about the role of engineering in the transformation of African agriculture. Those are the kind of activities that we need to think about that can enable us to create the kind of continent and country we want. In my closing remarks, I just want to say a couple of things. It is very clear that no human being, no country, no community No continent has been able to develop and participate in the global economy without engaging in science, technology, and innovation. It's very clear. We know that. So why do we want to play a small game then? This is very, very important. The option we have is to become consumers of this technology, but we've been consuming it for the last 60 years that I was born, and we know the impact on us. The alternative is for us to participate in the creation of this technology and knowledge so that we can beneficiate it within our continent, so that we can add value on it in our continent, and at the same time play an important role that we should play as part of the globe. This is very, very important. And this is where the excellence comes in. I remember the first paper we submitted from my lab in Stellenbosch University. The reviewers came back, trashed the paper, and suggested that this should be submitted to a local journal. My PhD student was crying. I sat him down. I said, just calm down. We spent the next week, and I wrote 8-page stinker. I call it stinker to the editor, and provided all the evidence because I believe that we're on top of the world in that particular issue, and explained why that paper must be accepted, and it was accepted within 12 hours. Now, that is not unique. That's not special about us. The important is that we are playing a big game. We are not trying to play small. So this is an important issue. The last point I want to make, Chair, is that our opportunity for this research here must be flexible enough to allow us to grab new opportunities. The opportunity created by the research here must be flexible enough, and the leadership of the chair must be smart enough to grasp new opportunities. When I took up the chair about 10 years ago, my area of work was in computational fluid dynamics modeling, airflow, packaging, refrigeration, and cold chains. I arrived in South Africa. 2 weeks later, 3 people walked into my office, said, we've been bringing planting materials of pomegranate from around the world. We see there is an opportunity to grow it in the Western Cape and make money. And we Googled and found one paper that you wrote when you were in the Middle East. Can you work with us to see how we can get value from these commodities here? The summary of the story is that the first research funding we got to work on the post-harvest technology of pomegranate, we got it from a company that was only bringing in planting materials, not selling pomegranate fruit. Why was that possible? We made any case. We showed the impact we're going to have in their company. We showed the impact we could have in their bottom line. We showed the possibility that they should trust us, that we can develop technology to launch their product anywhere in the world. And we got money from a company that was bringing only planting material, not post-harvest technology. Today, South Africa, Stellenbosch University, if you plot the graph of the growers of pomegranate around the world, we disappear because we are very small. But go to Science Direct, and I can guarantee you that the top 3 researchers on post-harvest technology of pomegranate are from South Africa. That is the role we want to play. That companies from UK can fly down to Stellenbosch, have a meeting with the lab, and fly out the same afternoon because they have important business to do. This is the kind of dream we want. We must think big, and we must be able to carry our people around with us here. Finally, we cannot underestimate the impact of human capacity. I ask myself, I've never lived in South Africa before. I never studied in South Africa. In fact, 30 years ago when I was leaving Nigeria heading to New Zealand, my passport made it very clear at the back that allowed to travel to Commonwealth countries and other places except South Africa, because South Africa was still under apartheid. So why would they now hire me as a researcher at Stellenbosch University? I don't think I'm that beautiful or handsome. But I believed that perhaps I had something to add to the scientific enterprise. So what is the next Linus? Does he have to come from New Zealand after training? Or can we find them in Limpopo or Venda and Accra? This is the challenge we have, but this is an opportunity we must grasp now. Thank you very much.
All right, I'm going to ask Dr. Sibanda to come forward next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Allow me to start with a couple of thank yous. There are only 3. Honorable Minister, thank you very much for that keynote. But most important, thank you for your contribution to the struggle. I'm sure what we are launching and witnessing today are the fruits that the seed that you planted. Thank you to you and your colleagues on behalf of Africa. I'd like to also personally thank the IDRC team. This may come as a surprise that I'm singling you out. I stand here as a product of an investment that you made to the University of Zimbabwe 40 years ago, when you invested in a small project on improving the productivity of indigenous Matebele goats in Zimbabwe. At the time I applied at the university as a research fellow under that program, I was told I could not register for a PhD, but I could work as a research fellow. Why? Because no one had ever invested time in indigenous goats. Where would you find the reference literature for that? But thank God I was able to register with the University of Reading in England, but do my research under that funding in Zimbabwe. And the output from that has become the reference library on how to improve productivity of indigenous Matebele goats. So thank you for that investment. My last thank you is to the organizers of this conference, because this morning I had my wow moment. And the wow moment relates to the topic of the day. They took us on a tour that has brought OR, who previously to me was Oliver Reginald Tambo, but now I can relate to him as OR because he's at my doorstep for the following reasons. I learned this morning, number one, that you need to celebrate luminaries and honor their legacy. His life lives on. And I've made a commitment that really I need to do my bit. I need to start by celebrating maybe my late husband, who was a pro-vice chancellor of a university in Zimbabwe. But more important, my own father, who has said he will not die until I'm a full professor. So he will get the same recognition. Second, I learned that there's nothing wrong with changing purpose. OR moved from being a scientist, a science teacher, to being a lawyer, actually went to school for that, and being a politician. So here I stand, from an animal scientist, a goat scientist, to someone who's invested 15 years of professional life being a policy advisor. And everyone says, but are you an economist? I say, no, I'm a goat scientist. So how do you advise on policy? Well, that's where my heart is, and that's what I've been doing. The third thing that I learned this morning from the tour is that from a national leader to a Pan-Africanist, and what really spoke to me were three things. The Morogoro Conference of 1969, where OR stood up, defied all odds, and said, this South African battle is not going to be for South Africans only, but anyone of any color can be part of MK. That was a defining moment for the struggle. The second one, which stood out with my name, was the Battle of Hwange in Rhodesia, very close to Victoria Falls, where OR, as the MK commander, was able to bring in the ZAPU, which is the Zimbabwe African Union that was fighting side by side with MK. National Zimbabweans, Rhodesians, but then Zimbabwean fighting for Zimbabwe, and South Africans side by side with a common enemy to liberate both Zimbabwe and South Africa. That, to me, was a telling moment, that whatever we do, we have to think beyond our own borders. We have to think beyond our own families and ourselves. Now, to the topic of the day. How do we champion research excellence in Africa? I want to believe that for as long as those who are affected by the problems that researchers are trying to solve are not part of the struggle, are not sitting as equals with respect, there will not be any investments, because the people whose problems we are trying to solve have to be the best messengers for the evidence that research is generating. So in my life as a policy advisor, I have learned that there are three things that are critical in having research that has impact. Number one, we have to generate the solid evidence. And for any researcher, that's the easiest part because that's core business. Generation of evidence, hypothesis, and results, that we all know how to do well. But where we have failed is on the number two requirement, finding the right messenger for the message that we generate. The people affected are civil society. The people doing the laws and the policies are your politicians. So for as long as you don't speak their language and they don't hear the language that you speak, we will always be at crossroads. We will generate a lot of outputs, but they'll remain on the shelf. Private sector will want to come up with innovations, will want to take the products to the people. But as long as we don't have the policy framework and the legislation in place, that will not happen. But also, as long as the people affected by the problems are not clear what the investment of public money is generating for them, they will either shoot it down or just watch us as we go like little cartoons, pursuing our own interests, yet we stand in the name of solving life's problems. So three things: generate the robust evidence, find the right messengers that will make sure there's policy change and right legislation, but most important, create the engagement platforms where the communication will happen. Now, what are the three key things that, for me, sum up the questions that we were given to talk about? Number one, all research has to be outcome-focused. Let's find that path, that trajectory that leads and connects us to real-life problems that will make a difference. We can start with our basic research, but build the storyline to show the outcome that will connect you to people and a change of their lives for the better. But also talking about outcome and connection. I've talked about national, but connect to the national agenda. Governments invest a lot of time in Agenda 2020, Agenda 2030, the national framework for policy. Most researchers shy away from understanding and granulating that to what it means to their own research. So be outcome-based, but there's no better place for outcome-based than the frameworks that have been created. We have the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. How is your research connecting to that? Because the impact will be local, national, and global, and we already have the framework for that. We also have our own, the Africa We Want, Agenda 2063, with 8 clear aspirations which place people at the center of that. How will your research connect to that? So outcome focus and connection to the local and the global are key. Number 2, engage and share. We will not be able to achieve impact if we don't engage. We are very good at engaging amongst our peers, but when it comes to the outer sphere, and there are different tools for engaging with these people that are outside our frame. They will be bored to death if they had to sit in a seminar like this one, particularly in our African context. In my past life, I've learned creative ways of doing this. Through theater for policy advocacy, we've been able to take science evidence to the people affected by the problem, and they themselves enact it into theater, and they advocate for policy change, and it has made a world of a difference. We also have oral storytelling as part of our culture. We have not developed the ear to understand those African stories that inform us, those songs that inform us of the struggle that people are going through, and they're trying to communicate and find a solution. And finally, it's about taking risks and being optimistic and being flexible, because it's never a straight line, but impact will only come if we are visionary with clear outcomes of how people's lives will change. We engage and share and sharpen our ideas, but take that bold decision of taking risks. There is one of the questions that I really want to speak to in my last 1 minute. What are funders supposed to do differently? one of the things that I really find is a disconnect, particularly for us in Africa, is that we Africans have been the biggest letdown to development. We've taken ourselves, particularly in my field in agriculture, from everything that our grandparents used to do. And we've disconnected that and made research the new way of solving problems that we are still to experience. And by this, I mean, can we just go back and collect those oral stories, package them through robotics, new knowledge, new machines that can translate that knowledge into evidence, and then scale up that which has worked. I think we've dismissed everything and said that's for anthropologists, that's for sociologists, and yet there are some answers. This reminds me of something I experienced last week. I was in Arusha, and I found a lady cooking in a three-legged pot. Once they've cooked in the three-legged pot, they turn the lid upside down and put food on there. It then occurred to me that we've advanced and now have warmers or microwaves, but the heat stays for 5 hours and they can have their warm evening meal just by turning the lid upside down. So surely there are many examples where we can go back to our roots. Then for funders, it will be making a call for proposals for scaling up what has worked rather than trying too many pilots. Unfortunately, I have seen too many pilots and very few Airbuses that we can fly. Thank you.
I think we're going to have a very lively discussion very shortly. All right, I'm going to ask our final panelist to come and introduce her thoughts. Professor Moloto.
Thank you, Chair. The Honorable Minister of Science and Technology, Minister Kubai Ngubane, the CEO of the NRF, Dr. Kobela, the Chairman of the Oliver Reginald Tambo Foundation, Dr. Duma Kosi, and all eminent guests, and good afternoon. It is with great pleasure that I actually have been given this opportunity to come and speak here. And actually, before I move on, I'd like to thank Dr. Lindiwe for a brief history on O.R. Tambo. My first encounter with O.R. Tambo was somewhere in the, well, not encounter, the first time I heard of O.R. Tambo was in the mid-80s to about late 80s, when, as a little child, I would hear people singing songs about O.R. Tambo, and the songs were very catchy. So I would join in and sing them with no knowledge in the world what this man stood for. Unfortunately, as I grew just a little bit older, in 1993, he passed away, and really had very little engagement with what he was all about. But this morning, I must say that it was quite a lesson and of the man that O.R. Tambo is. You always hear on TV this and that, but when you see the work and you see the evidence of type of man he was and how he used his leadership to influence the world, it's quite calming and actually encouraging for us. When I was asked to be part of this panel, I kind of questioned why me? I don't know, older people, more wiser, more experience. What do I have to give? Then I started thinking that maybe perhaps I'm just the right person to be called here, because I'm actually probably more poised to actually champion research excellence in Africa. People of my generation, researchers of my generation, and those who come after me are actually the ones who are probably at the pinnacle of discovering new things and actually taking Africa into new heights. And if you think about it, we are the generation who was at the advent of the internet and will probably experience the much talk about Industrial Revolution 4.0. We will experience it. And therefore, it gives us the opportunity to actually use that. And with all these technologies, what we found is that the world has become actually a global village. So how then does Africa, in terms of research excellence, position itself in this global village? I will actually quote my Vice Chancellor because he likes to repeat this. He likes to say that we need to be locally relevant while being globally competitive. And those words, they resonate with me, where I think we could use what we've learned, use our collaboration, international collaborations to actually find solutions that are for challenges that are pertinent in Africa. So using the knowledge that I've gained through my studies, through all the traveling and the collaborations, so that we not only just do science for the sake of science, but we do it to solve many challenges that Africa is facing. If I give you an example of what I'm currently working on in my research, I'm looking at using solar to solve or for energy production as well as for water purification. However, besides this being a very hot topic globally, if you search the internet right now, you'll find quite a lot of work on using solar to solve these two issues. But what is important for us is that how can we, knowing the situation in Africa or cognizant of the challenges of Africa, how can we now make research that it's accessible to Africa? So one thing we know is cost. So my plan is to find processes that are much cheaper. And in addition, we have many minerals. I think we've had the different speakers who talked about that Africa is endowed with many resources, mineral resources. So the aim is to beneficiate these resources so that we can use them for our own good rather than taking them out. So this is just one example. The solar example is just one example, but there are many examples out there where we could do research that is relevant to Africa. And however, I actually tried to answer one of the questions. You say, how do we achieve this? What we need to do is to achieve sustainable research excellence and support is that we need to have adequate funding and support. I think with African governments, I think they could try and be more serious in funding research. I must say that without shooting my foot, to thank the South African government, they have probably tried to support research as far as they can. However, more could be done. But this is required that for anything meaningful to happen, we need to fund research adequately and also invest in the next cohort of researchers. I think with the chair initiatives, mostly senior researchers have been awarded chairs. And I understand why. They have more experience, they have, I guess, evidence that they can do the job. But it will be important to also invest in the next generation of researchers because in Africa especially, there's quite a big gap between the old and there's a missing middle, and then there's suddenly the junior who've been trained to be PhDs or postdoctoral fellows and so forth. So the question is, how do we take them from being here to being excellent researchers of the future? So by not neglecting them, by making sure that we invest strongly in the eminent researchers. So in light of that, I must say that for me, what really stands out is that we need adequate support. We need to support young and up-and-coming researchers. We need to do research that is locally relevant but globally competitive. We are not an island. We need to compete globally. So it's important to do those three things. I have a long list, I guess, of trying to address some of the questions, but for the sake of time, I will wait for you to ask questions and then we can engage on some of these topics that I think are important for all of us who are sitting here to answer. So with that, I'd like to thank you.
Right, I think we've heard some interesting thoughts there. What we're going to do now is perhaps I'll pose a couple of questions to our panelists, but I really want to get as many of you who are here, who've obviously come out to spend this afternoon to engage with our panelists. I want to give you really the lion's share of the discussion. But I think if I can just in summary reflect on some of the thoughts that I think resonated throughout all of your introductory comments, really the idea of knowledge that is relevant for the local, for the communities in which it is located, solving real problems. I think that was certainly a thought that struck me. The focus, obviously, on collaboration, I think, was a key thought for Professor Okeke. Beyond just that knowledge must be relevant for the societies in which it takes place, but also funding models needing to be realistic in terms of what is put on the table, projects also being handled in a way that is above reproach as far as making sure that people are honorable with their intentions, and obviously also the call for women researchers to be included and brought on the table. I loved what you said, Professor Opara, about activism being really the bedrock of Oliver Tambo's thinking as a scientist, really. But the integration of the continent, I think initiatives such as has been announced today will definitely go a long way in stemming the tide against what you are calling the scramble for African intellectual capital. I think that's something to be thinking about. But also, you spoke about leveraging on relationships, on funding to make sure that that's a symbiotic relationship. Also, not just, it's an ongoing conversation, is it not, about Africans not just being consumers of technology, but also being creators and playing the big game. I thought that was also a good thought. Dr. Savanda, I mean, you're a walking example in a way, as you shared your own history and the fact that somebody took a chance on the research you wanted to pursue. You're a walking example of exactly the kind of thing that can be achieved with the initiatives that are being announced today. But also, I think I was particularly struck by your idea of looking back on indigenous knowledge systems, not rejecting those, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and seeing how we can contribute from an African mindset what we already know for the benefit of the world. So I thought that was absolutely crucial, engaging in a way that's accessible, in a way that policymakers, governments, local people will be able to almost really become champions, right, of the work that you want done. I thought that was a very interesting thought. And finally, Dr. Moloto, raising, I suppose, the issue of young people, bringing the next wave of researchers on board, making sure that they are not left behind. So those are my summaries, those are my takeouts from what you said. Perhaps we can start by asking this question, and it's an age-old one for the continent, I think, as a whole. The idea that we've often looked at our economies as extractive-based economies. We've spoken at many times about the so-called resource curse, for example. How do we make sure that exactly the theme that really I think all of you have spoken about in different ways, that the research that is championed, the funding that we try to attract is relevant to African communities where they are located, such that, there's a snowball effect, both in terms of what governments will commit to, both in terms of what funders want to do, and making sure that local communities and indeed the continent benefits from the kind of research that we want versus everything going away and being taken once again. I don't know which one of you wants to answer that question. There are mics and they're on.
Have a go.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. Just to answer that question, I just want to put some data out there. Historically, I'm an agricultural engineer, so I work in the agricultural and land-based industries. If you look at the investment in research, both nationally and globally, the evidence shows that probably more than 85% has been on the production. You may call it extraction, but if it is in production agriculture, it's like cultivation, production in the field. And in the post-harvest, after harvest, value addition, marketing strategies, and so on, less than 10%. The question then is, why is that? Why is that? Then why are we surprised that the cocoa, probably more than 60-70% is produced on our continent? on the west coast of Africa, historically for the nearly 200 years, is processed somewhere in Northern Europe. So we know how to grow cocoa. That's why we produce it for the world. Then we need to start thinking about, we must know how to process cocoa that we produce. The same thing with diamond, platinum, and so on and so forth. So there is some policy implication, there's an investment implication, there's also a capacity implication in terms of human capacity. We need to invest in research in these areas. Just to finish on that, if you go to the supermarket and buy anything ready to eat, so to say, let's say a loaf of bread, just imagine what percentage of the price you pay goes back to the farmer cultivation. How many of us think about it? Probably less than 15%. So where does the value lie? The value lies after harvest. So it's a way of thinking, and we need to also put our money where our mouth is. So that shift in funding strategy in terms of research is quite important.
So no longer should we be thinking about Swiss chocolate or Swiss jewelry, right?
There's no reason why we cannot think about African chocolate. After all, we grow it. We grow it. I mean, it's unthinkable. I mean, for all of us here who have traveled around the world, sometimes you get quite passionate about this. And you cry in your hotel room. You cry in your hotel room. Say, we have largest amount of youthful population in the world, not employed. All sorts of negative statistics. We don't want to go over that. But those opportunities to create jobs for our people, we put it in a box and we export it elsewhere. So I think that is a major shift that we have to make.
Dr. Sibande, let me bring you in the conversation. We can talk about beneficiation, but money talks, right? If it's underfunded, if these research programs are underfunded, we can yell all we want, but if there's no money, how are we going to solve the problem?
I think the big question is, where is the money supposed to come from? And where does it come from for those products that have been well funded for research? And I think really we always look at government, particularly for most of Africa, but I think the answer lies in partnerships, and partnerships with private sector who ultimately will get financial gain from the investment. And I think, unfortunately, one of the things that we need to demystify in most of Africa is who is private sector. I'll be blunt, for most of where we come from, private sector is big multinationals. And yet, your farmer is a private entrepreneur who's trying to make a business out of farming. But extend their life beyond the farm. Take them along the value chain, but not just them. Bring in the youth as an opportunity for creating employment. And really, government can meet some of the funding for startups, but once that startup is flying, that's big business because it can then partner with. So one of the things that I believe needs to be done is, particularly when we look at our universities, the model that has really worked well in America is the land grant system, whereby we have many universities in a country, but step outside the door, the gate of the university, there is poverty. But there is a wastage of produce, there is indigenous fruits, there is indigenous vegetables, but no one counts those as marketable products. Yet we are all scrambling to the market to buy them, but we can't get them in town. Yet the university is sitting there watching this whole waste and not seeing an opportunity for business.
Professor Okeka, you spoke earlier about making sure that the research that we're talking about is relevant for the communities, to the societies in which it is located. Perhaps you can segue from that conversation to expand on that thought.
That's what I'm about asking, because I don't know if I got the first question right. That is what the society will benefit from the research. So what I'm saying is that we know about our local products, but these days we seem to sweep them under the carpet. We don't patronize those that bring some of these local products, like fruits and what have you. We rather like to encourage buying the foreign ones, which is not from our place. And then most of, when you go into the locality, like in the villages, they don't like those ones, but they want to use those ones, but we are not appreciating those. So that's why I said, even if it is physical science or biological or agric, we need to go back
to what is common to everybody, local, which we can get without much trouble or pain or waste of money. But these days, you see, for those in agriculture, you know what I'm saying. You don't want these native fruits or crops. You want to westernize them. And then we end up wasting our economy and people will not like it. So that is what I said by, even in sciences, like in physics, there was a time in secondary school we invented these meter bridges with simple plywood, rail boxes, and what have you, that we normally import. And if you tell you the money involved in importing just one of them, we could use it to make up to 100 of such rail boxes. So that's what I mean by addressing the local available resources. You can save money and thereby saving the nation from wasting their money and the economy will grow. That's what I mean. Thank you.
Dr. Moloto, you touched on the youth, and what's that famous phrase that we hear politicians mostly talk about? Solving African problems by Africans for Africans. How do we then, bring into the youth? We've heard, of course, about, the problem of youth unemployment across the continent, not just only in South Africa, but how do we make sure that we build the necessary human capital to be able to solve the problems of the future involving the youth for the continent, by the continent?
I think the biggest thing is education, and not just any education. Education in the right sector, or in, if we talk about using our resources and beneficiation, why can't we skill up our people so that they know how to build their own catalytic converters? We have platinum in South Africa, we have manganese. Why don't you make manganese-based batteries? We have all these things, but we're not exploiting them, and we don't have a skill force to deal with them. Actually, that's the biggest problem. We might have all these grand ideas that we need to invest in that, but we don't have the skill force, and it's a fact. So it starts with education and investment into the right type of skills. If it means creating programs where we're focusing on certain a speciality, then we have to do that. I think just education for the sake of education is not good. We need to be focused. The government, the Department of Higher Education, I hope they are here somewhere. They could look at strengthening our FETs so that they build the skills that are missing, So to me, that's where the key is. That's where the gap is.
Okay. As I said, I don't want to dominate the conversation. I'd rather the room has the lion's share of the discussion. You are able, if you can just raise your hand, you are able to ask a question or engage or comment even from wherever you are with the speakers available at your desks. So let me open up the floor. I think we've got a question over there, or a comment rather. May I just ask you to identify yourself and please go ahead. You, sir, yes. Right there, in the orange shirt.
All right, thank you.
All right, we are in business.
Yes.
Thank you. When I look across Africa, I'm a bit disappointed by our governments. I'm very happy that South Africa seems to be an exception in terms of investing in research. We don't seem to value investment in research to an extent that, there are commitments that let's put like 1% of our budget, national fiscus, towards research, but many a time, it actually doesn't happen in reality. So I think as long as our governments don't actually set aside the resources for serious research, that championing research excellence that you are talking about there can never be achieved. We cannot expect other people to lead the research that you prioritize. you need to initiate things yourself and then invite other partners to boost the research excellence, rather than, because usually someone who funds will call the shots. So the research agenda there is also compromised in many instances if you are not putting money into it.
Sure.
The second issue that I would also like to raise is about our academic institutions or our tertiary institutions. That I quite agree with the panelists there that we actually need a review of our curricula to ensure there is entrepreneurship skills, and such that these people don't go out of universities to look for jobs, but instead they actually create jobs.
All right,
Thank
fantastic. Right, well, so what I'll do is I'll perhaps take 2 or 3 comments or questions and then allow the panelists to respond. And I think that way we can get through quite a few quickly. The lady in the blue.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, colleagues. First, I think I need to thank the South African government for putting out the bilateral and multilateral platforms for research in the continent, and also for this announcement. But I think one of the concerns, or something that we need to note, much as we are putting the investments towards this research, also we have not reversed the pattern of Africa being just a place where data is being collected. When we see most of these multinational agreements or funders, research is being done on Africa, about Africans, and that's where they get to formulate all these models of solving particular challenges. So now I'm curious as to how can we also accelerate, as much as we are going outside there to find partners and find local business people to be funding our research. How far are we willing to reverse this mentality of just making Africa to be a guinea pig, to be producing results and solutions for the rest of the world, yet they are not trickling down to reversing the problems in the continent?
And then sold to us at a premium, right? All right, lady.
Yeah. Can I answer?
I've chosen a colleague there, and then we'll come to you, sir.
Okay, thank you and good afternoon, colleagues. I'm Thobela Ngukwana from the University of Pretoria. I'm an animal scientist. My take on this, first let me congratulate the department and NRF for the announcement, and I hope, and this is a plea to all universities in South Africa and across Africa, that they find young South Africans to supervise for postgraduate studies. Because many a times I hear that South Africans cannot be found to do a master's or a PhD study. And to me, that is a big problem. Now, moving forward, my take on this as an agriculturist. I want to say I agree mostly with everything that the speakers have said. And in South Africa, we're lucky that the private sector still loves us. The private sector loves us to a point that we have benefited from what multinationals have brought into the country. As an animal scientist, I can tell you that what we eat in South Africa is because of the advanced research that was done in European countries and brought to South Africa and adopted in South Africa. But the problem is that that kind of research and those developments have not translated to the person in the rural areas or a small-scale producer who can say, I'm self-sufficient in my own household in terms of food security, and the surplus that I have, I can supply to my community or the people around me. So my question is, how do we make sure that as we appreciate all the developments that have come onto our shores and are feeding our people? I attended the World Food Prize conference in America last year. And one of the big chicken producers in the world is American. And they stood up and said, we are ready to feed Africa, and we are able and willing. Now, my question is, that is so true, and they are feeding us. Many people are feeding us. How do we downscale all those technologies? Because this is knowledge economy that is there, that just needs to be applied at the level where users can utilize it.
Right.
That's my
Let's
question.
get those three answered, and then I'll give another round for people to raise their hands. Let's start with the question of governments and the role of governments. South Africa is being recognized here, Honorable Minister, for what you've, what has been announced today. But in general, how can other governments perhaps engage in similar ways? What are your reflections on that? Anyone?
That is a very big problem because most African governments, they don't invest in research and science. Just like former Honorable Minister for Science and Technology, Professor Essong said this morning, that while in post, he could see that only 2% came from African government. And then 98%, where is it coming from? From the outsiders. And as such, when this is the case, you cannot claim your research project, and you don't have total control, because most of the fund comes from outside. And if they are funding it almost 100%, you must dance to their tune, to the tune of the outside government, not African government, because they are not keen about funding fully or partially the research.
Okay.
They only want anything that we put food straight on the table without wisdom. But that's not research in science. It takes a longer time.
But the problem that's also been raised isn't just about governments. A concern was raised about multinationals and their own interests that aren't always, I suppose, aligned to the interests of the local communities. So how do we navigate those tricky spaces where funding is available, but is it to the benefit of the communities where the research might be located? I think, Dr. Sibanda, you want to weigh in?
So my response to both those issues is that they are dealing with accountability. We get bold commitments that are made and no delivery. But in between, there's something that's missing. We're missing bona fide African local institutions that can follow through and monitor those commitments and use bold evidence to hold institutions to account. In most cases, it's a blame game. When government makes a wrong decision, we say to hell, they will suffer, they will see the consequences, and yet it's us who suffer. But if we had those strong civil society African NGOs that are really using evidence and tracking, but also finding the right messengers who are not insulting, but carrying the message to say, guys, if you had done this, this is what you would have benefited. Because you did not do this, this is the mess we are in. But it ends up being a fighting match, and no one listens to their enemies. But if we go close to government and civil society and be friends that use evidence, one day they sort of call upon you for advice, and that's when they use the evidence for policy making.
Prof. Opara, you spoke about the intellectual scramble for Africa, and I suppose the question of the guinea pigs comes into this. The World Bank tells us that a large percentage of sub-Saharan African research is non-local, it's transitory, people don't spend a long time at institutions, that kind of all feeds. How do we make sure that, and it speaks to this theme of, again, relevance for local communities, this idea that even when you have technology and information on a large scale, to scale it down and make it workable for locals to be able to benefit, which I think was the other question that was raised.
Thank you. I think to answer this question, there is something we can learn from O.R. Tambo and the organization he belongs to. For the last few years or many years, we've been complaining about different aspects of our continent. Many of them we are responsible for. Governance, lack of investment in particular areas. Where is the activism? If something is not right, who has stood up and drew the line and maybe put their life on the line? Because we know that that's what people like Oliver Tambo had to do to change the system. We're all victims, and everybody's complaining and pointing fingers. I think these things are now so serious that we have to change the game. And that's what the ANC had to do. That's what Oliver Tambo had to do. Just give you one example. You cannot do this with the current percentage of our people that depend on others to have proper meal in a day. Africa must industrialize. For too long, we have been very timid about it. I remember as a graduate student of engineering 30-something years ago, when we talked about mechanization and industrialization, we begin to use several words to make it special for Africa: small scale, appropriate technology. We kill it with so many words that at the end of the day, we don't do anything. But meanwhile, when mobile phone landed, we bought the best mobile phone. We never waited for appropriate mobile phone to use. So this is a way of thinking that we must consciously realize, accept that the current system is not acceptable. Just to finish. Now, who is our private sector? My sister was acting here. And if you come to my village where I was born in Nigeria, I'll tell you who's private sector. It's my late mother. I used to go with her to the farm. I was an agricultural engineering student. Nothing I did 5 years in the university had anything to do with what we did when we went to the farm. So what was my future? Industry. So we must now begin to think just beyond farming alone or beyond research alone and begin to ask bigger questions about our governments, how we rule each other, about industrialization, power supply, good roads, clean water supply. If you do those things, you begin to see that you now begin to have a private sector that can invest in research. It is not surprising that the majority of the funding for our research is coming from outside. Who is that outside? Yeah, particularly mainly the private sector outside. Why can't we create our own private sector? What does it take? We need to create those conditions for private sector to flourish. If there is no power to switch on, no clean water running, no sanitation, no road, how about, where is this private sector? So this is very important. We must tackle it, and then you begin to see private sector spring out to support the research we do.
Dr. Moloto?
I wanted to comment on entrepreneurship. You know, in the US, 50% of startups, they fail. But more importantly, 50% succeed. And in Africa, we tend to be afraid of failure. There's a lack of investment in researchers who are trying to be entrepreneurial, because there's I guess, being scared of failing. And if they do invest, there's so much red tape that it becomes impossible to actually continue to try and embark on this entrepreneurial endeavor. So I will say that I think with all the funding agencies, including the government and private sector, is to take a chance. Is to take a chance and invest in researchers who are trying to, you know, to develop that industry that you're talking about. Is to try and it starts there. It starts small scale, as you said. Yes, but my in terms of entrepreneurship is to invest in researchers who are trying to do that. That's my comment.
Right, we had a question right here at the front.
Yes, the most important point in this meeting is that apart from South Africa, to be sincere to you, most of the other African countries have not been investing in space science and technology. You heard this morning from the Minister of Science and Technology, former minister, that 2%, I just want to emphasize what Professor Keke has said, 2% is being invested, and you want foreigners to come and invest for you. I have worked for the government of South Africa for 6 years, working for National Science Foundation, overseeing the astronomy research in South Africa. And they are putting in money. So these things we're saying is not referring to South Africa. Either through the African Union, we should tell all the other African countries to invest, to get ready. Otherwise, we are wasting our time here if you are not ready to invest. Africa is not only South Africa. It's the rest of them. So that's the most important point you have to add.
Yeah, it brings us to that question of the African Renaissance, right? Whether or not it's still a myth or indeed just a concept. That's one thought. We've got a hand over there. No? Was that a hand? Yes, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I'll first commend South Africa for always leading transformation on the African continent. I also have full appreciation for those who are believing that we should not only be consumers of technology, but rather utilize technology to solve African problems. But here is my take. I didn't hear any of the panelists addressing the issue of ethics, patenting, copyright, protection of knowledge, and all that. And here again, we are talking about money in Africa, but nobody has talked about financial control and management. Now for the research community, us, there's been a number of, I don't know about other African countries, but Namibia, a small nation, we are investing in research. We do have a Namibia-South African collaboration initiative, which is annually budgeted for. Research it has no outcome. It's not outcome-based. It's collecting dust somewhere at the universities and so on. So we are living in a generation who wants tangible outcomes. They want to see. Yeah. It's too theoretical and abstract. We have become another political agenda, vote buying, where you have to go around and no. We should hold research institutions financially accountable and responsible. Okay. Surely we cannot only one. So if that is the route that we are taking, a new model that we are developing, that we should actually really, wherever we are getting money from, it's sponsorships or it's government, so that we can account for money and research to achieve its purpose. Okay. And the so-called excellence, I think.
Fantastic, right, that's the second one. Perhaps we'll take one right there at the back. There's a hand, I'll take you and then I'll take you and then we'll close it up.
Oh, thank you. My name is Lufunoti Korombi. I'm a cyber law lawyer or consultant, whichever works better. Minister was speaking about the 60% of research fund. She hopes it goes to women. I was not so sure if I should clap my hands. Then Dr. Sibanda was saying each of us must play our bit. So I was like, yeah, I want to play my bit, but I was not so sure if I should clap hands. So I want to give you my story. There are many women like myself who wants to contribute. I want to do PhD/LLD. But the way the educational system is and the way the funding is structured, I have to be put in a certain box where I must fit in. I haven't fit in any of those boxes, meaning that my dream to do PhD or LLD, I either have to pay it for myself or I must forget it. Council of Higher Education does research every year, seeing who is doing well and who is not, and monitoring how blacks are progressing in terms of education and research. So when I look at their findings and I look at my own experience, it's not like black people or black women don't want to study, but the structures that are put there, the policies and the systems are certainly not enabling. I'm a cyber lawyer because I'm qualified in both. I do IT, I do law. So you can't tell me to be a lawyer or to be an IT person. I need to do it the way I understand. I will be contributing meaningfully to the developmental issues that I know we have and are identified in the 2063 agenda in our NDP and in any other regional documents that we would have read to say where Africa is going. So the other thing is I applied at the University of Pretoria. I'm glad some people are coming from there. And I told this professor that I am a cyber law person, so I'm not a lawyer of the one they know, the original one. I am multidisciplinary, so you will have, so I told them this is what I want to do, and I gave them a solution to say you'll co-supervise with somebody who supervised me when I was doing LLM, because I did LLM specialization in IT law. That's what I want to be. I want to be in IT and I want to be in law. I don't want to be in a box. So, you know you have to do research. You must tell them what you want to research about. You spend all your time, he agrees, he will look at this thing. Then I submit my abstract, I apply, they disappeared. I send emails, do all sorts of things, then I receive a one-liner email after some time that they don't have a supervisor. But I just spoke to a supervisor before I spend all those hours doing a research. So I'm saying, me speaking on behalf of maybe other women who have experienced the same thing that I've experienced, we want to study. But if it's not University of Pretoria, it's how government has structured the funding.
Okay, we'll raise that one, and I think we had a question over there, or a comment.
Professor Maza, it's a comment. I'm Professor Maza, UNESCO UNISA Africa Chair in Nanosciences and Nanotechnology. My request is at the ground level. It's geared towards the Honorable Minister. We do receive, we should commend the DST and the South African government for this outstanding milestone in cementing further the pyramid of the African Renaissance in Science and Technology of the Oliver Tambo initiative. The point is that I personally receive by monthly basis around 2 to 3 African fellows from North of Africa, from the East, West, Central Africa, and so on a monthly basis. And we do suffer extensively about the visa aspect. I will really appeal and a plea to the Honorable Minister to intervene at the DIRCO level and to ensure that the application of a visa for scientists will be treated in a mild way somehow, not in a restrictive way. I must admit, the application of our fellows from some parts of Africa, in particular west of Africa, it takes more than 6 months. This is not correct. This is not correct. We have to play it correctly. At the European Union, for example, in my case, if I have to flow over Africa, I have to use my French passport that I inherited by marriage from my wife. If I use my Algerian passport or my South African ID, it's not easy to get in. But I use my French passport, I can go wherever I wish. This is incorrect.
Okay. I'll let the panelists respond perhaps to any of the issues that has been raised as we round up our discussion, because we will run out of time. The question about collaboration, the role of the African Union, perhaps using other platforms to make sure that there is collaboration, that was something that was raised. The issue of patents and intellectual property, that was something that was raised. Perhaps one of you wants to respond to that. I think, Dr. Sibanda, you've already, in a way, addressed some of what was being raised about cyber law. A GOAT scientist who's now a policy advisor, perhaps you could navigate some more on that. And really, I suppose, we don't want to make this a talk shop, right? We don't want to make these initiatives things that are a pie in the sky. If we can't have ease of movement within our own continent to make sure we facilitate these opportunities in a way that can translate meaningfully. So that's a question that I think is worth addressing that's been raised there. So any of you can answer really any of the questions that have been raised that you choose to.
I'll be quick on the issue of patents. Yes, we did not speak specifically to that, but under policy and legislation, it's really your remit as a scientist, as an innovator, to make sure that whatever you generate as new technology, it's registered, it's patented if it qualifies. But I think where we've always fallen short is what my sister raised over there, where there is the extractive tendency where people come, get research in their own countries, publish and patent. But the bottom line is, where were we when somebody else saw that opportunity. It's now a global village, it's competitive. We need to put in our own laws to safeguard our own heritage. But even with data now, with big data, you do your research, you don't publish. After 2 years, there's new legislation which may soon become global, that if it's internationally funded, it's now for everybody. Anybody can tell your story. So I think the pressure is on us. You own it, use it, share it, protect it, but use it for a public good. And I think the doors have opened, the windows have opened. There's no way we can just lie low and say it's ours. Somebody will take it away from us. And then for my sister, I think flexibility is important. You know, you want something, there are different ways of getting there. And it takes education on both sides, both educating your supervisors and also you seizing the moment. You won't wake up tomorrow and be what you want. It's a journey. But at the moment, ride on what comes. And I think my colleague Linus brought in the example that you've got applicants who want to study a specific area, but there's no funding for it. But he's got funding for grapefruit, for lack of a better specific vegetable fruit that he's dealing with. But once you do that, other opportunities will open up, or even in that game, you'll deepen your game and be respected. So follow the trend, be flexible, but stay in the game. Don't lose hope. Shaking your head.
Yes, I just want to comment on this issue of mobility. I think this is very, very crucial. Whatever we do, if we don't take care of the ease of mobility of talent, we're going to have a major problem.
Yeah.
We have to find a way. There may be different reasons why a particular nation will act in a particular way, a particular region, but if we really want the Africa that we want, if we want this idea of O.R. Tambo Africa Research Chair initiative to work, we have to work very hard on this issue of mobility. The mobility is not only within or between countries and the rest, but also the whole world of Africans in diaspora who see the opportunity for them to make a contribution. There are so many instances where it is easier for a graduate, BSc, who has just graduated, to get a travel document or to stay in a particular African country than another African who supervises him or her living in that country. How does that make sense? You may explain it with whatever you like, all the legal implications or whatever, but then the message will get out. When the message gets out, it's a bad message, and we'll suffer in the long term. So we have to work hard, and this is why I call the science activism comes in. When those instances come up, we must transmit it to the policy people. We must write articles. We must have conferences. We must have seminars like this to let them know, because sometimes people don't know, but also to know the implications. Because this is very, very important. Just a case in point is we have a graduate who has just finished on first degree, or I think master's, applied for residence because there was opportunity to get some work experience and got it. An African postdoc who has spent 15, 20 years in Europe was lured in back to train that particular candidate, applied for the same thing, and I was told to go back to his country of birth and get his curriculum and course outline that he graduated 20 years ago. There may be reasons why those laws were in place, but we must respond to them now. Otherwise, we're going to run into a lot of problems. So very, very practical. We need to do something about the issue of mobility.
That's it. Professor Okeke?
Right. We have heard what they said about mobility, which also, I buy the same idea. The mobility is very, very crucial. We cannot produce things and sit on them here. And then you cannot sell out your product, no matter how you think it is. But at the same time, I think we need to be very careful about doing it in a very erratic way. There are so many ways we can do it, like you said, writing up a conference. But the important thing is that the message will get to them. So that is what, yeah.
Okay. Dr. Mulot, I suppose maybe let me give you the final word on this, because we talk about the Renaissance, but this idea that initiatives like that could be part of galvanizing not only intellectual capital from the continent, but indeed across the diaspora, bringing Africans together and creating centers of excellence that are relevant to the needs of this continent. I think the young people all over this continent will be looking for solutions like that, perhaps even are hungry for knowledge like that. What's your thought?
Definitely. I mean, there's so many young people all over the world trained in best universities out there who are just seeking an opportunity to come back and contribute to the motherland. So the best we can do is to facilitate that, is to create opportunities so they can be able to come back and contribute. And that's up to funders, I guess, and us who are here to create spaces for them to be able to engage with us and collaborate and contribute. So there is definitely, there's so many people now who are studying all over the world, MIT, Harvard, and all sorts of universities. I think we need to make it attractive for them to come back to Africa.
Yeah. On the visa issue and the mobility issue, the minister's handed me a note to let the room know that the Department of Home Affairs has allocated dedicated staff for researchers who need visas. She says we'll request for the matter to be attended to urgently, as we've not been aware. It was raised by EU ambassadors this morning, and we have made a commitment. That's what the minister has said. So she's making a specific commitment here to say that that is something that will be addressed. Colleagues, I imagine for those of you who want to stay a little longer, there will be a chance for some more interactions. Perhaps you can approach our panelists directly for as long as they're going to be around. I know there will be a cocktail event a little later on, so there'll be further opportunities of engagement. But for our discussion, I think we have run out of time, and so I think we'll leave it there. I'd like to now call on Dr. Dumangosi, who is, of course, the chairperson of the Oliver and Adelaide Tambo Foundation, to come and do a vote of thanks.
Just one question, because I've been putting my hand throughout, and this is disruptive. Chair, I think one of the important aspects of OR is that when one strategy did not work, he moved on to the other. And we are here because he moved from the guerrilla warfare without mass mobilization. We are sitting in the same situation. Academics and researchers see this as their fiefdom. When is massification of the research agenda going to start? That's the whole question I want to leave you with. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Program Director. Although maybe in terms of today, you actually given a moderator responsibility. A consummate diplomat, a dedicated leader, a champion of human rights. Tambo was also a mathematical genius. The launch of this initiative, which is named after our stalwart and leader, would not come at a more fitting time. The advent of the fourth industrial revolution and upsurge in the understanding of the critical role that science and mathematics can play to address the triple threats of unemployment, inequality, poverty, have made the timing of this initiative not just important, but critical. Honorable Minister, Siabong. The DG, I think he has just walked out. Thank you very much. And Dr. Q, I think that's a term I had. They say Dr. Q. There's something interesting that has happened, Dr. Q. On the pamphlet right at the back, which reflects the program, I want to actually make sure that the CEO, the doctor, archives these pamphlets. I am sitting among professors and doctors, and I feel very great, but I haven't acquired that level. So I think what will be very important, that please just keep it safe. I'm going to work for it. I'll come back and you'll declare. On the 27th of January 1987, Oliver Tambo was at the Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. There are 3 paragraphs that I've actually picked out, because from 87 to 1991, he worked himself to the end of his life. It reads, for the point that he says, we would like to express our appreciation to you all for giving us this opportunity to speak at this eminent seat of learning and research. An important part of your raison d'etre is the pursuit of knowledge. As scholars and thinkers, you occupy the contested boundary between the truth and prejudice. Engage in a struggle of the mind to redefine the correlation between the two. We believe that as you push the frontiers of darkness backwards, you must contribute also to determine the purpose of learning and that context to help better human life in all its aspects. One of the ideas that has inspired many of us in my generation of Black South Africans is that race should cease to be a category that governs relations between and among people. Scientific inquiry and social experience have combined to bury the primitive notion that skin pigmentation was a factor which affects the intellectual capacity of individuals, an element that determines people's natural place in society. One hopes that never again will science prostitute itself to serve the ignoble purpose of those who have, in the past, argued in favor of the false thesis about the natural superiority of white over black, of so-called Aryans over non-Aryans, of race over another, close quote. On behalf of the Oliver and Adelaide Tambo Foundation, I would like to extend my deepest gratitude to all the stakeholders that has brought this project to life. The National Research Foundation have worked tirelessly to ensure that all of us are gathered here today with a concrete and extremely innovative way to champion African excellence. Mr. Bongani Bingwa and the esteemed panelists, thank you for sharing your valuable insights with us. Thank you very much. I think there is actually a part which might be quite important, where at the same meeting, open quotes, we have come here today, that's Tambo. Please note, he always starts with we. He doesn't say me as Oliver Tambo. That's why the country knows who Nelson Mandela is. Maybe most of the people in the world may not know who is Oliver Tambo. We have come here today to speak about racism, to reflect on the bitter experience of our people as victims of the pernicious system of apartheid. We would also like to convey to you something of the resolve of the despised millions of our country to be victims no longer, to anticipate themselves and be free from the oppressors, free the oppressors from the burdens that all who practice injustices impose upon themselves. It is our hope that in the difficult days ahead, you will stand with us, lending your intellectual excellence to the accomplishment of those objectives, and that using the power you derive from the discovery of the truth about racism in South Africa, you will help us remake our part of the world into a corner of a globe which all humanity can be proud of. Let me just say, there's Maya Angelou's quotation, which is very important. It reads, "I have learned that people will forget what you say. People will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you make them feel." So I think with Tambo, all of us who have actually had an opportunity to interact with his work, we are actually able to know that he was a man who passed away in 1993. He was able, as a leader of the ANC, to report back to the organization in 1991. In 1993, when he actually passed away, he was a very sad person. It was a few days after Chris Hani was assassinated. On the other side, I think we can also say, in the past week, when we had the Global Citizen Program, I think you know that the whole world knows who's Nelson Mandela. So on the other side, I think in 2007, we had Umamo Adelaide Tambo passing on. The foundation is both partners. It's Oliver and Adelaide Tambo Foundation. Umamo Tambo left us 2007 in January, but it was after he said she wants to celebrate the Christmas of 2006 in a way that she was celebrating the renaming of the airport, Oliver and Adelaide Tambo, O.R. Tambo International Airport, because that was something she thought was not possible, and she was a very happy person when she passed on in January 2007. I'm just saying it sounds like very contradictory, but on my part, I'd like to thank all of you for coming here tonight. But also, let me just say, in the name of Tambo, we actually have to rewrite or reread the history of South Africa and be able to keep his legacy, because he has done a lot for us. Thank you very much.
On that light note, I think we will exit. We will go to the foyer, and we'll continue from there, and I think that's where the cocktail event will happen. Thank you very much.
No, yes.